Catherine Sterling pressed her dead husband's worn leather glove against her chest and screamed at the top of her lungs, "If not one single man in this valley can ride my stallion, then not one single man in this valley is worth a damn thing to me." 25 men had already tried. 25 men had already bled. And somewhere on a dusty road, no one watched a broken cowboy with nothing left was riding straight toward the one challenge that would either finish him or finally bring him back to life. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Catherine Sterling didn't cry at her husband's funeral. She stood at the edge of his grave with her hands clasped behind her back, her jaw set like iron, her eyes dry as the cracked earth beneath her boots. The preacher read his verses. The neighbors bowed their heads. The wind moved through the valley the way it always did, slow and indifferent, as if Thomas Sterling's passing was just one more thing the land had decided to swallow whole. She didn't cry. Not then. She cried 3 days later, alone in the dark of the barn, with her face pressed into the neck of a black stallion that hadn't let another living soul touch him since the moment Thomas died. Tempest. That was his name. And the name fit like a branding iron burned straight into the soul of anyone who got close enough to find out why. He was enormous, 17 hands at the shoulder, pure black from muzzle to tail, with eyes that didn't look like the eyes of an animal, so much as the eyes of something that had already decided it didn't owe the world a single thing. Thomas had found him half wild, half starved, and fully furious on the edge of their property 6 years before, and every man in Dry Creek Valley had told him to shoot the beast or sell him to someone else's problem. Thomas had smiled, his quiet smile, shaken his head, and spent the next 4 months doing nothing but sitting near that horse. Not riding, not training, just sitting. Just existing in the same space, letting the animal decide on its own terms whether a human being was worth tolerating. And Tempest had decided, not right away, not easily, but he had decided. He let Thomas ride him. Only Thomas. And when Thomas's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in the middle of planting season, when he dropped between the rows of corn without a sound and didn't get back up, Tempest had stood at the far end of the pasture and screamed. Not the way horses neigh or whinny. He had screamed. Every man on the ranch said they'd never heard anything like it in their lives, and 3 of them quit before the end of the week, not because of the grief, but because of the sound. Because it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like something that understood. Catherine understood too. She understood that Tempest was grieving the same as her. She understood that the horse wasn't mean, and wasn't cursed, and wasn't the devil in a black coat, the way people in town like to say. He was just done. Done with strangers. Done with hands that didn't know him. Done with anyone who wasn't Thomas. But Catherine wasn't done. She was 41 years old, alone on a ranch that owed 2 seasons of debt to the bank, with 4 hired hands who stayed out of loyalty more than wages, and a horse that was worth more money than she could calculate, if she could just find someone who could reach him. She didn't sleep the night she made her decision. She sat at Thomas's old desk with a piece of paper and a lamp burning low, and she wrote it out in her careful, precise handwriting. The handwriting, Thomas used to say, looked like it belonged in a schoolhouse. She wrote it, folded it, and in the morning she rode into town herself and nailed it to the post outside the general store. Any man who can ride Tempest for 10 full minutes without being thrown will be paid $50 in gold. Come to the Sterling Ranch. Come ready. She was back home before the ink was dry on the gossip. The first man arrived 2 days later. His name was Roy Briggs, and he was the kind of man who announced himself before he arrived. You heard his reputation come through the door, and then his boots came after. He had ridden in competitions from Texas to Colorado. He had broken horses that other men swore were unbreakable. He came with 2 friends who were already laughing at the story of some widow woman offering gold for what amounted to a horse ride, and he walked up to Catherine with his hat tilted back and his thumbs in his belt loops and said, "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but $50 feels a little light for something this easy. How about we say 75 and I'll have that horse eating out of my hand before sundown? Catherine looked at him for a long moment. 50, she said. And if you'd like to start the corrals open. Roy lasted 47 seconds. He came off Tempest so hard that the fence post cracked where his shoulder hit it, and his two friends stopped laughing, and one of them said something under his breath that sounded like, "Lord have mercy." Roy sat in the dirt for a moment and said nothing. His hat was 6 feet away. His pride was further. When he got up, he didn't look at Catherine. He just walked to his horse and rode away. That was the beginning. Over the following 3 weeks, 24 more men came. They came in all shapes and all sizes and with all varieties of confidence. They came angry, and they came cocky, and they came careful, and they came with tricks, with ropes rigged a certain way, with spurs, sharpened down to points with sedatives. They tried to hide in feed that Catherine removed without a word before they ever got close. One man came with a blindfold for the horse and lasted 11 seconds. One man came with 2 partners and tried to have them hold the horse's head while he mounted, and Tempest responded by going completely still, completely, eerily still, and then detonating the moment the second man let go, like something that had been calculating the exact right moment to move. The town watched all of it, and the town, the way towns do, began to talk. Mabel Hutchins, who ran the dry goods store, and considered herself the primary authority on everything that happened within 10 miles, said that Catherine Sterling had lost her mind along with her husband. "That horse is a killer," she said, "and she's just waiting to watch one of those poor men die so she can feel something again." Jeremiah Cole, who was the closest thing Dry Creek Valley had to a banker, said the whole thing was irresponsible, and someone ought to speak to Catherine about it before she ended up liable for a broken neck. He said it from a safe distance. He did not volunteer to speak to Catherine himself. The younger men in town, the ones who had already tried and failed, did what men do when they're humiliated. They decided it was the woman's fault. She'd trained the horse wrong. She'd let it go feral. She was making fools of good men on purpose. There was something wrong with her. There had always been something wrong with her. Catherine heard all of it. She heard it because small towns don't know how to whisper. She heard it in the feed store, and she heard it through the wall of the post office, and she heard it from the wives of the men who had failed, who weren't always as careful as they thought they were about what they said, within earshot of a woman who was buying supplies and choosing not to respond. She heard every word. She kept nailing the notice back up every time someone took it down. The 25th man arrived on a Thursday afternoon when the sun was doing that thing it does in late summer, hanging too long and too heavy, turning everything gold and exhausted. His name was Pete Dawson, and he was locally famous for exactly one thing he had never in 30 years of working with horses been thrown. He said this himself loudly to the small crowd that had gathered, because word traveled fast when Pete Dawson rode somewhere with purpose. He said it twice. He lasted 8 seconds. He landed face first, and when he stood up, the left side of his face was bleeding, and his eyes had the particular look of a man who has just had a belief about himself surgically removed without warning. He turned and looked at Catherine and said, "That animal is not right." Catherine said, "No." Pete waited. "He's not wrong either," she said. Pete stared at her. Then he left. Catherine walked back to the barn and sat down on the stool near Tempest's stall and put her face in her hands, not crying, just resting there, in the place that still smelled like Thomas. The horse moved to the stall door and put his nose near her shoulder, not quite touching, and she said without looking up, I know, I'm still looking." The notice came down again that night. Catherine found it in the morning torn from the post lying in the mud. Someone had written across it in charcoal, "Give up." She stood there a moment, looked at it, picked it up, went home, wrote another one, rode back into town, put it back up. Mabel Hutchins watched from her window and said nothing. Even she knew in that particular moment that this was not a woman you argued with. Jake Morrison heard about it on a Saturday. He was in a town called Harlow, 40 miles east of Dry Creek Valley, sitting at the far end of a bar with a glass he wasn't really drinking from. Listening to two men at the next table argue about something he wasn't really listening to, until one of them said horse and widow and $50 in the same breath, and something in him went very still. He didn't turn around. He just listened. 25 men, the first man said, every one of them thrown, some of them hurt. What kind of horse? The second man asked. Black Stallion. Big as a barn. Mean as sin. And she's still running the challenge. Every week. Still putting the notice up. People say she's lost her mind. Maybe she has, the second man said and drank his beer. Jake looked at his own glass for a moment. Then he set it down, stood up, picked up his hat from the bar, walked outside. His horse a plain brown mare named Nobody, which was the kind of name a man gives an animal when he's made his peace with the fact that he himself is nobody going nowhere, was tied at the post. He stood next to her for a while. The sun was going down, and the air had that thin end-of-summer quality that always made him feel like something was ending. Something was always ending with Jake. He'd been 34 years old for 8 months and felt 60. He'd come back from the war with both arms and both legs and most of his body and none of himself. He wasn't bitter about it exactly. Bitterness required energy he didn't have. He was just empty. Like a house where the family has moved out and taken everything, even the curtains, and now the wind just moves through the rooms. He worked. He moved on. He worked somewhere else. He moved on again. He didn't stay anywhere because anywhere stopped being anywhere after a few weeks and became just another place where he was going through motions and waiting for something to change that he had stopped believing would change. But he'd been good with horses once. Before the war, he'd grown up on a ranch in Wyoming where his father had taught him not to ride, not to break, but to listen. His father had been a quiet man, the way some men are quiet, when they've figured out that the world is not improved by adding to its noise. He'd taught Jake that a horse was always telling you something. Always. And the only question was whether you were paying enough attention to hear it. Jake had been paying attention his whole life. He just hadn't had anything worth paying attention to for a long time. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up onto Nobody and sat there a moment. 40 miles. The roads were dry. He could make it in a day and a half if he started now. He didn't know why he was considering this. He had no reason to go. He had no reason not to. He turned Nobody east. Then he stopped. Then he turned her west toward Dry Creek Valley. All right, he said quietly, to no one in particular. To Nobody maybe, or to the evening air, or to whatever it was inside him that had just made a decision without his full consent. All right, let's go see. He arrived at the ranch at dusk on a Monday, which was good timing. He had not planned for another challenger, was in the corral when he rode up and Jake stopped Nobody at the fence and watched. The man in the corral was big. Rangy, long-armed, the kind of build that looked like it had been assembled specifically for physical confrontation. He was already on Tempest's back, already in motion, already pulling hard on the reins with both hands, and driving his heels into the horse's sides. And the horse was something else entirely. Jake watched Tempest the way his father had taught him to watch. Not the dramatics, not the bucking, the movement, the particular rhythm of how Tempest threw his weight, the specific way he used his hindquarters. The fact, and this was the thing Jake locked onto immediately, that Tempest wasn't random. He wasn't panicking. He was deliberate. Every motion had an intention. The horse was as calculating as any opponent Jake had ever faced across a card table or a split-second decision in the middle of a firefight. And watching him work, Jake felt something happen in his chest that he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Interest. Actual honest interest. The big rangy man came off hard and skidded 2 feet in the dirt, and the crowd along the fence, maybe 15 people, made the sound that crowds make when something goes wrong, and they're relieved it wasn't them. Jake sat on Nobody and watched Tempest come to a stop in the center of the corral and stand there, head high, sides heaving, and look at the fence, at the people, at for just a moment, just one fraction of a second at Jake. Jake looked back. He didn't nod. He didn't react. He just looked. And then a woman was standing next to his horse. He hadn't heard her walk up, which said something about how hard he'd been concentrating. She was somewhere in her early 40s, dark-haired with the kind of face that had been through enough that it had stopped performing emotions it didn't feel. She wasn't looking at the fallen man in the corral. She was looking at Jake, specifically at his eyes, specifically at what he'd been looking at. "You weren't watching the rider," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am," Jake said. "What were you watching?" "The horse," Jake said. "Tempest." Something moved through her expression. Not quite surprise, more like recognition. "You've heard of him," she said. "Heard of the challenge," Jake said. "Came to look." "Just look." He considered that for a moment. "Not sure yet," he said. Catherine Sterling looked at him for another long moment, the way she'd been looking at all the other men, with that careful, steady assessment that didn't give anything away. And then she said, "I'm Catherine Sterling. This is my ranch. That is my horse. If you decide you're doing more than looking, you're welcome to come back in the morning when the light is better and the horse is less worked up." "Jake Morrison," he said. "Much obliged." She nodded and walked away. He watched her go. Then he looked back at the corral where Tempest was still standing in the center, still watching the fence, still carrying himself like a creature that had already decided the verdict on every creature that stood on the other side of it. Jake looked at that horse for a long time. Then he found the bunkhouse, talked a hired hand into giving him a cot for the night, and lay in the dark with his hands behind his head and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for him. Usually the dark brought the bad things. The things from the war. The things from before the war. The slow accumulation of places he'd been and people he'd let down, and versions of himself he'd left behind like shed skins. That night, for the first time in longer than he could account for the dark, was just dark. He fell asleep thinking about the way Tempest had looked at the fence. In the morning, before anyone else was up, he walked to the corral. Tempest was at the far end of the enclosure. He turned when Jake came to the fence, put his ears back, put his head down. Every signal a horse has for go away. "I have nothing for you, there is nothing here." Jake leaned on the fence rail and waited. He didn't approach the gate. He didn't enter. He just stood there. The way his father had stood near that first difficult horse on the Wyoming ranch. Just existing in the same space. Just making himself part of the landscape without demanding anything from it. Tempest watched him. Suspicious. Then bored. Then suspicious again. Jake stayed. The sun came up. The hired hand started moving around the ranch. Someone lit a fire for coffee. A rooster somewhere offered its opinion on the morning. Jake stayed at the fence. After about 40 minutes, Tempest moved. Not toward him. Just moved. Shifted his position. Chose for reasons of his own to be slightly less far away than he had been. Jake noticed. Said nothing. Did nothing. Just continued to exist at the fence. Catherine Sterling came out of the house with a cup of coffee, saw him there, and stopped. She stood at a distance and watched for a moment. Then she turned around and went back inside without saying anything, which Jake thought was about the most respectful thing anyone had done for him in recent memory. He didn't try to ride Tempest that day, or the next. He just came to the fence in the morning and stayed. Sometimes he talked not at Tempest, specifically just talking. About small things, about the weather, about a story he half remembered from somewhere, about his father. He talked the way people talk to themselves when they're alone and finally feel safe enough to make noise. Tempest's ears moved, back and forward, listening even when the horse pretended not to be. On the third morning, Tempest came to the fence. Just walked right up, stopped about 6 feet short of Jake, put his head up, looked at him with those enormous, impossible eyes that didn't look like animal eyes. Jake looked back. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Jake said quietly. "Not a single thing. We can just stand here if that's all you want." Tempest exhaled. A long, slow breath. And then he moved the remaining 6 feet and put his nose against Jake's open hand. Jake stood very still. He felt the warmth of the horse's breath on his palm. He felt the rough velvet of the muzzle. He felt the aliveness of the animal, the deep, serious aliveness of something that had been choosing all this time what it let near it. He felt something unlock in his chest. He didn't name it, but he felt it. From the porch of the house where she had been watching without appearing to watch every morning for 3 days. Catherine Sterling pressed her husband's worn leather glove against her chest and did the thing she had not done at his funeral and had not done in the month since. She stood there in the early morning light and she wept, not because she was sad, because she recognized what she was seeing, because she knew now without any doubt that she had finally found him. She had finally found the second man in her life who understood. Catherine Sterling didn't go back inside after she stopped crying. She stood on that porch for a long time, the leather glove pressed against her chest, watching Jake Morrison stand at that fence while Tempest breathed against his open palm, and she did something she hadn't done since Thomas died. She let herself hope for something. Not for herself. Not yet. Just for the horse. Just for that animal who had been carrying his grief the same way she had been carrying hers in silence and in fury, with nobody around who could reach him. She let herself hope that maybe this man was real. Then she went inside and made breakfast for 8 people, because a ranch doesn't stop needing feeding just because something important is happening in the corral. Jake came in with the hired hands at 7. He sat at the end of the table where nobody sat, because nobody wanted the drafty corner, and he ate what was put in front of him and said thank you, and didn't say much else. The hands watched him the way men watch a stranger they haven't decided about yet. Not hostile, not friendly, just measuring. Hank, who had been on the Sterling Ranch for 11 years and considered himself its unofficial foreman, looked at Jake across the table and said, "You gonna ride today?" Jake looked up. "Not today," he said. Hank waited for more. More didn't come. "You been here 3 days?" Hank said. "Most men try first morning." "I know," Jake said. Tempest threw the last one into the fence post hard enough to crack the wood. "I saw. Broke Roy Briggs's collarbone." "I heard." Hank looked at him for another moment. "So, what are you waiting for?" Jake considered the question with the same quiet seriousness he seemed to apply to everything. "For the right time," he said. Then he stood up, picked up his plate, carried it to the basin, and walked back outside. Hank looked at Catherine. Catherine looked at her coffee. "Don't," she said before he could say anything. "I wasn't going to say nothing," Hank said. "You were about to say he's wasting our time and the challenge is costing us, and I should tell him to either try or move on." Hank was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said, "ain't none of that wrong." "No," Catherine said. "But it ain't all right either." She set down her cup. "Leave him alone, Hank." Hank left him alone. But the other hands weren't as disciplined, and word moved fast in close quarters. And by that afternoon, 3 of them had drifted past the corral fence at various points just to observe, because a man who'd been standing at a fence for 3 days without entering had become the most interesting thing happening on the property, which was saying something when the property included a horse that had broken 25 men in 3 weeks. What they saw didn't make obvious sense to any of them. Jake was inside the corral now, not near the horse, just inside. Sitting on the ground near the gate with his hat off and his arms resting on his knees, talking in a voice too low to hear from the fence. Tempest was at the far end, not running, not threatening, just watching. The way the horse always watched, with that concentrated, serious attention that had nothing idle in it. Billy, who was 19 and had been on the ranch 4 months and had very strong opinions, he shared freely whether or not they were requested, said to nobody in particular, "That ain't gonna work. You can't just talk a horse into letting you ride him." From inside the corral, without looking up, Jake said, "You'd be surprised." Billy startled. He hadn't realized the voice carried that far. "You can hear me?" "Every word," Jake said. Billy looked at the other hands. One of them, old Sam, who'd worked horses his whole life and had the hands to prove it was watching Tempest, with an expression that Billy couldn't read. "Sam," Billy said, "what do you think?" Sam said, "I think you should be quiet and watch." Billy was quiet and watched. Tempest, at the far end of the corral, took 3 steps toward Jake, stopped, stood there with his ears moving, his nostrils flaring, cataloging something only he could understand. Then he took 2 more steps and stopped again. Jake didn't look up. "Well," Sam said quietly, "I'll be." That night at supper, the talk at the table was different. Not louder, quieter. The kind of quiet that happens when men are thinking instead of filling space with noise. Hank didn't say anything about the challenge or the cost or the time. He passed the bread and talked about the fence line on the north pasture that needed mending and whether they'd get rain before the end of the week. Jake ate and didn't say anything, and Catherine watched him from across the table and tried to identify what it was about this particular man that was different from the other 25. It wasn't the silence plenty of men were silent. It wasn't the patience she'd seen patient men. It was something else. Something in the way he occupied space. The way he moved through a room or a corral or a conversation, as if he was always conscious of exactly how much room he was taking up and always trying not to take more than was offered. Thomas had been like that. She looked down at her plate before the thought could go further. After supper, Jake stood outside on the porch for a while, not doing anything, just standing in the dark. Catherine came out to close the shutters and found him there, and almost went back inside, but something stopped her. Some instinct she trusted more than her brain in that particular moment. She stood next to him, not close, just near. "How long are you planning to keep this up?" she asked. "Keep what up?" "The waiting." He thought about it. "Until it's time." "And how do you know when it's time?" "He'll tell me," Jake said. She looked at him sideways. "Tempest." "Yes, ma'am?" "He'll tell you." "When a horse trusts you enough to test you," Jake said, "he tells you. It's not something you can miss." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "My husband used to say something like that," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of its own accord. Jake didn't respond right away. He just stood there in the dark looking out at the property that was hers and had been Thomas's, and before Thomas's had belonged to a family who built it from nothing. When he did speak, he said, "He sound that horse." He was the only one who ever did. "How long did it take him?" "4 months, Catherine said. "He just sat near him, every day. Thomas was the most patient man I ever knew." She paused. "People thought he was slow. He wasn't slow. He was just thorough." Jake nodded. Something in the nod said he understood that distinction in a personal way. "You lose someone?" Catherine asked. She didn't know why she was asking. She wasn't usually a woman who pushed into other people's private spaces. Jake was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Lost a lot of people. War does that." A pause. "Lost myself somewhere in there too. Still looking." Catherine absorbed that. She didn't offer a response that made it smaller or tidier than it was. She just let it sit in the air between them, which was the right thing to do, and some part of her recognized that instinctively, the way she recognized real things when she encountered them. "Well," she said finally, "you know where the bunkhouse is." "Yes, ma'am." She went inside. He stayed on the porch another hour. In the morning, everything changed. Jake was at the fence before sunrise, same as every morning. But this morning, Tempest wasn't at the far end of the enclosure. He was at the gate. Standing there in the dark, close enough that when Jake arrived, he could see the outline of the horse before his eyes adjusted to the early light. And when they did adjust, Tempest was looking at him with an expression that Jake had learned in 4 days of careful attention to read. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't the wariness from the first day. It was something closer to impatience. Like a question that had been asked and was waiting on an answer. Jake stood at the gate for a moment, then he opened it and walked in. Tempest didn't move. Jake walked to him, not slowly, the way he'd been approaching, but normally the way you walk toward something you're not afraid of, and stood next to him and put his hand on the horse's neck and felt the muscle there, the warmth, the aliveness that was so concentrated it was almost uncomfortable to be next to. Tempest shivered once under his hand, then went still. "All right," Jake said quietly. "All right. I hear you." He didn't saddle him. He didn't bridle him. He took a handful of mane, put his weight on it slowly to see what happened, felt Tempest accept the weight and shift to compensate for it, and then in one smooth motion swung up onto the horse's bare back and sat there. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then Tempest moved, not the explosive detonation that had launched 25 men through the air. Something different. Something deliberate and testing a sudden sharp lurch to the left, a fast cut back to the right, a drop of the hindquarters that would have unseated anyone whose balance wasn't ahead of it. Jake moved with it. Not fighting, not gripping, just moving with the horse the way water moves with the shape of the land it crosses. He breathed, he balanced. He existed on that horse's back without insisting on it. Tempest threw another move, a sudden hard spin that changed direction at the last possible moment. Jake stayed. A rear not the full explosion he was capable of, but a test. A real question. Jake leaned forward, stayed. Tempest came down and stood still and breathed hard for a moment. And then he did something that old Sam, who had been watching from the fence since he'd seen the light at the gate, said he would never see again in his life, and never did. Tempest walked. Just walked. Forward. Easy. Carrying Jake like he'd been doing it for years. Around the corral in a slow, deliberate circle with the sound of his hooves on the packed earth, the only thing in the pre-dawn silence. Sam pressed his hand over his mouth. Didn't say a word. Jake rode. He rode for 20 minutes. Not the 10 of the challenge. 20 without the crowd, without the gold, without anyone watching except Sam and the early morning light that was turning everything pink and gold at the edges. He rode, and Tempest moved under him with a power that was unlike anything he'd ever felt beneath him. Not just physical power, though there was that immense and rolling like a river in flood, but something else. Something that felt like recognition. Like the horse was finally doing what he was built to do, not for someone who wanted to use him, but alongside someone who wanted to be there. When Jake finally slid off, his legs were shaking. Not from fear. From something else entirely. He stood next to Tempest, and the horse put his head against Jake's chest and stood there, and Jake put his arms around that big black neck and stood there too, and the two of them were just still for a long moment in the pink morning light. Sam walked quietly back to the bunkhouse and knocked on Hank's door. "What?" Hank said from inside, rough with sleep. "You need to get up," Sam said. "It's not even sunrise." "I know," Sam said. "Get up anyway. You need to see something before anybody else makes it complicated." Hank grumbled and got up. He came to the fence and saw Jake standing with Tempest and stood there for a full 30 seconds not saying anything. Then he said, "When?" "This morning," Sam said. "Before anyone was up. He just walked in and got on." "No saddle." "No saddle. No bridle, nothing." Hank was quiet again. Then, "Does she know?" "Not yet," Sam said. Hank thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Let's keep it that way for right now." He looked at Sam. "Just let them be." Sam nodded. They walked away from the fence and left Jake and Tempest alone in the morning. But the town found out by noon. Billy had seen it from the bunkhouse window. Billy, who had very strong opinions he freely shared this particular piece of information with the freedom and speed of a man who doesn't understand the value of keeping a thing quiet. By the time he'd told 2 people in town on the supply run, those 2 people had told 4 others, and by noon, the question moving through Dry Creek Valley like a brush fire was whether the drifter at the Sterling Ranch had actually genuinely finally found a way to manage Tempest, and if he had, what exactly that meant, and whether Catherine Sterling had lost her mind for a different reason than anyone had originally thought. Mabel Hutchins had new opinions. She shared them at the general store to anyone within earshot, which on a busy noon was approximately 9 people, and her opinion was as follows. That woman has lost her senses over a pretty face. She's gonna hand her late husband's ranch over to some drifter nobody knows anything about, and we'll all watch her learn the hard way what happens when you trust a stranger. One of the 9 people listening was Catherine Sterling, who had come in for flour and coffee and other things she needed, and who had been standing at the end of the counter for approximately 45 seconds of Mabel's speech before Mabel noticed her. There was a silence of a particular quality. Catherine looked at Mabel. Mabel opened her mouth. Catherine said Mabel. Just the name, nothing else. Mabel closed her mouth. Catherine finished her business at the counter, paid, picked up her supplies, and walked to the door. At the door, she stopped without turning around and said to the room in general, "A man doesn't become a stranger just because he arrived somewhere you didn't expect him. Sometimes he's exactly who he was supposed to be. He just took a long time getting there." She paused. Same as most good things. Then she left. The 9 people in the general store were quiet for a while. Then Mabel said, "Well," and didn't finish the sentence. She didn't repeat her opinion for the rest of the afternoon. What Catherine didn't say, what she hadn't said to anyone, and didn't know how to start saying, was that she'd seen it. She'd been awake at sunrise, and she'd looked out the window, and she'd seen Jake in the corral with Tempest. And what she'd seen had stopped her from moving for a full 5 minutes. She'd stood at her window and watched a man she'd known 4 days ride her husband's horse. The horse that had not been ridden by anyone in over a year, with a ease and a naturalness that looked less like a feat and more like a reunion. She'd held the back of a chair to stay upright, because the thing she'd seen wasn't just a man riding a horse. It was something that Thomas had told her about once. Something he'd read somewhere or heard somewhere about how sometimes an animal chooses a person the same way a person chooses an animal, not based on strength or dominance, but based on something interior and unnameable that only the animal knows. Thomas had said he believed Tempest chose him, not the other way around. He'd said it with that quiet, certain way he had of saying true things. Watching Jake, she'd thought the horse chose him again, and that thought had done something to her that she wasn't prepared for and wasn't going to name yet, and didn't look at directly the way you don't look directly at the sun. She got through the day. The ranch kept moving because ranches do the fence line needed work, and the horses in the north pasture needed checking, and there was always something that needed doing, and she'd built her life these past 14 months on the simple discipline of doing the next thing. So she did the next things. She kept moving. But at supper she looked at Jake across the table and said, "I heard you were in the corral this morning." The table went quiet. Not dramatically, just the particular quiet of 8 people deciding not to chew loudly for a moment. Jake met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Before the challenge time?" "Yes, ma'am." "That doesn't count for the $50, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. "I know." "Then why?" He considered it for a moment. Then he said, "Because the $50 isn't the point." The table stayed quiet. "Then what is?" Catherine said. Jake looked at her steadily. "He was ready," he said. "A horse tells you when he's ready. You don't decide for him. You just show up when he says it's time." A pause. "The challenge is for the town. What happened this morning was between me and him." Catherine held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her fork and went back to eating. "All right," she said. That was all. But Hank caught Sam's eye across the table, and Sam caught Billy's, and Billy, for once in his life, didn't say anything at all. The formal challenge happened 2 days later. Word had gone out the way. Word always went out in a valley that ran on information, the way other places ran on water, and by 10 in the morning, there were 30 people at the fence. More than had come for any previous challenger. They came because this time, the story was different. They came because of what Billy had said, and what others had repeated and expanded and altered the way stories do when they pass through enough hands. They came because Catherine Sterling, who had nailed that notice back up every single time it was torn down, had told 3 people quietly and separately that she thought this one might be different. And all 3 of those people had told 5 others, and here they were. Mabel Hutchins was there. So was Jeremiah Cole, who never came to anything involving the Sterling Ranch, but who had decided this fell under the category of civic interest. So were a dozen women who had come mostly to see Catherine, because women in small towns maintain a complicated solidarity with each other, even when they're also gossiping about each other, and they wanted to be there when whatever happened happened. Pete Dawson was there, the 25th man, still carrying the mark of the fence post on his cheek. He stood at the far end of the crowd with his arms crossed and a look on his face that was working hard not to be what it was, which was hope. He didn't want to hope. He thought hoping for a stranger was foolish, but he was there, which said everything hope doesn't say out loud. Jake came out of the bunkhouse at 10 past 10. He walked to the corral, the same way he always walked everywhere. No performance in it, no awareness of the audience, just a man going somewhere he intended to go. He was carrying nothing. No equipment, no special gear. He went to the gate, opened it, and stepped inside. Tempest was in the center of the corral. The crowd at the fence went still in the way crowds go still when they collectively decide to hold their breath. Jake stood inside the gate. He and Tempest looked at each other across the distance of the corral. The horse's ears were forward. His head was up. He was reading Jake the way he read everything, completely seriously, without any part of his attention somewhere else. Jake walked toward him. Not slow, not fast, normal. The way you walk toward something you're not afraid of and don't need to pretend with. He stopped 3 feet short of Tempest and stood there. For 30 seconds, neither of them moved. Then Jake said in the voice that carried just enough to reach the fence but wasn't directed at the fence, "You with me?" Tempest moved his nose forward and touched Jake's shoulder. Someone in the crowd made a sound that was not quite a word. Jake put his hand on Tempest's neck, took a handful of mane, and swung up in one clean motion. What came next was not what anyone expected, because they were expecting a fight. They'd come for 26 versions of the same story, man versus horse, force versus resistance, the violent spectacle of something wild trying to throw off something tame. They'd come for that. What they got was entirely different. Tempest moved, but it wasn't the explosion. It was a test. Quick, sharp, intelligent, a series of movements that would have unseated anyone who was on the horse instead of with it. Jake met every single one of them with a balance and a calm that read less like horsemanship and more like conversation. Back and forth. Question and answer. A language that nobody watching fully understood, but everyone watching could feel. Then Tempest stopped testing and started running. Not away from Jake. With him. They went around that corral the way a storm goes around a valley, fast and enormous, and somehow completely in control of itself, and the crowd at the fence stopped being a crowd and became 30 individual people experiencing something private and unrepeatable, each one in their own private way. Mabel Hutchins pressed her hand to her mouth. Pete Dawson uncrossed his arms. Old Sam put his hat over his heart like it was a funeral or a wedding or something in between. And Catherine Sterling, who was standing at the fence the same as everyone else, who had made herself stand there with everyone else, because she wasn't going to watch this from a distance. Catherine Sterling watched Jake Morrison ride her husband's horse and felt 2 things at the exact same time, which is the most difficult kind of feeling there is. She felt Thomas. She felt Jake. She felt not confusion, not betrayal, just both, at the same time, in the same moment, like they occupied the same space without displacing each other, the way 2 true things can both be true without one making the other less so. 10 minutes passed. Someone in the crowd started counting out loud at 8 minutes. By 9 minutes, 3 people were counting with them. By 10, it was most of the fence voices, low and rhythmic and collective, in a way that felt for those 30 seconds like a congregation at something it didn't have a name for. At 10 minutes, Jake eased Tempest to a stop in the center of the corral. The crowd erupted. Not politely. Not the reserved kind of applause that small towns give at official occasions. This was something else. This was 30 people releasing something they'd been holding without knowing they were holding it. The sound of people who came expecting one story and got another, and are reacting to the version they actually needed. It was the sound of a valley that had spent 3 weeks watching things fail, suddenly watching something succeed, and feeling it in a place below explanation. Jake sat still on Tempest's back while the noise went up around them, and Tempest stood still too, not restless, not spooked, just still as if this moment was something both of them had agreed to inhabit together. Then Jake looked up. He looked at Catherine. She looked at him, and something passed between them across that corral, across the noise and the crowd, and the 3 weeks of challenge, and the 14 months of loss, and the 40 miles, and the nameless thing that had made him turn his horse west instead of east on a Saturday evening in a town called Harlow. Something passed between them that wasn't a word, and wasn't a look exactly, and didn't need to be either of those things. Jake slid off Tempest's back. Tempest stood beside him. Catherine walked into the corral. The crowd went quiet again. The fast, complete quiet of people who understand they are watching something private even from a distance. She walked up to Jake and stopped 2 feet from him and looked at him the way she'd been looking at men for 3 weeks, that careful, steady, nothing-wasted look, and said, "You did it." "Yes, ma'am," Jake said. She reached into her coat and produced a small cloth bag that clinked with the weight of $50 in gold and held it out. Jake looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "I appreciate it, but I don't want the money." Catherine's hand stayed where it was. Her face didn't change. But something in her eyes did something that had been prepared for this possibility and was still surprised by it. "What do you want?" she said. Jake was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure I know how to answer that yet," he said honestly. "But I know it's not this." He looked at the bag, then back at her. "Whatever I came here for, it wasn't $50. Jeremiah Cole, standing at the fence, said loudly, "You fulfilled the terms of the challenge. You've earned it. Take the money, son." Jake didn't look at Jeremiah Cole. He kept looking at Catherine. "Ma'am," he said, "you asked for someone who could ride Tempest. The question I'm asking myself is, what did you really need?" The crowd was very quiet. Catherine lowered the bag slowly. She looked at him for a long time. Not the measuring look. Something else. Something that had to do with the window this morning and Thomas's glove, and 2 things being true at the same time. "I needed to know," she said finally, "if there was anyone left who could understand what my husband understood." "And?" Jake said. Catherine looked at Tempest. The horse was standing next to Jake with his head at Jake's shoulder, easy and calm, and utterly unlike himself as the town had known him for a year, and the sight of it was so much like something from before, from the years of Thomas, from the years when this ranch had a particular kind of life in it, that Catherine had to breathe carefully for a moment. "And now I know," she said quietly. Jake nodded. He looked at Tempest. The horse leaned slightly into his shoulder. "I don't have anywhere I need to be," Jake said slowly. "And you've got a ranch that's short-handed and a horse that's going to need—" He paused. "He's going to need time. He's going to need consistency. Somebody who can keep showing up." He looked at her. "I could do that, if the offer was there. It doesn't have to be about the money." Catherine studied him with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. "It would be a job," she said. "A real one, not charity." "I don't want charity," Jake said. "I want the work." "You'd have to earn Hank's trust," she said. "That'll take longer than Tempest." Something actually crossed his face at that. A real smile. The first one she'd seen from him. It changed his whole face. That smile made him look younger and less finished, and more like whoever he'd been before. Whatever happened to him had happened. "I'll take my chances," he said. Catherine was quiet for one more long moment. Then she put the gold bag back in her coat pocket and said, "Be at the barn at sunup. Hank'll show you what needs doing." She turned to walk back to the fence. "Mrs. Sterling," Jake said. She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping that notice up." Catherine stood with her back to him. The crowd at the fence was watching. Mabel Hutchins was watching. Pete Dawson was watching. All 30 people were watching this woman in her late husband's valley, on her late husband's ranch, near her late husband's horse. She said without turning around, "Thank you for coming." Then she walked back to the fence and through the crowd and back toward her house. And the crowd parted for her the way crowds part for someone who has just done something no one can quite name. Behind her, Tempest made a sound low and resonant. Nothing like a whinny, something deeper than that. And Jake Morrison stood in the center of the corral in the silence that followed and understood that whatever he'd been looking for on that road west, whatever nameless thing had turned his horse in this direction, he was standing in the middle of it right now. He just didn't know yet how big it was. He was at the barn at sunup. Not almost sunup. Not close to sunup. Sunup exactly the way a man shows up when he's made a decision and isn't second-guessing it. Hank was already there, which Jake suspected was a test, and Hank didn't acknowledge being surprised, which Jake suspected was also a test. Hank handed him a pitchfork and pointed at the stalls and said, "Start there. Work left to right. Don't skip any." Then he walked away without further instruction, which was the third test, because a man who needs to be told how to muck a stall is a man who lied about knowing horses. Jake started there, worked left to right, didn't skip any. By the time Catherine came out of the house 2 hours later, Jake had finished the stalls, repaired a broken latch on the grain room door that had apparently been broken long enough that people had stopped seeing it, and was carrying water with the same quiet, economical movement he brought to everything. Hank was watching him from the far side of the barn with an expression that gave nothing away, which Catherine had learned in 11 years meant Hank was cautiously impressed. She didn't say anything about it. She went about her morning. But the ranch had a different feeling that day. She noticed it and didn't examine it directly. It was the kind of feeling that breaks if you look at it too hard. The first week passed like that, Jake working the ranch, adjusting around him, the way a household adjusts around a new person, slowly and without announcement. He was careful with boundaries he could sense without being told. He ate with the hands and stayed out of Catherine's private spaces and asked Hank before he changed how anything was done, even when it was obvious something could be done better. Hank noticed that too. Didn't say so. But the set of his shoulders changed over the course of the week, going from watchful to something more like provisional acceptance. Tempest was the clearest measure of everything. Every morning, Jake went to the corral. Every morning, Tempest came to him, not immediately, always with that same testing pause that seemed to be less about distrust now and more about ritual, about maintaining some private form of dignity. And then the horse would come, and Jake would work with him, and what happened between them during those morning hours was something the rest of the hands gradually stopped interrupting with commentary. Even Billy stopped offering opinions. What happened in that corral had established itself as something that didn't benefit from narration. What none of them knew, what Jake had not told anyone, was that each morning with Tempest was also a kind of private work he was doing on himself. Because something about standing in that corral with a creature who demanded honesty above everything else made dishonesty with himself harder to maintain. And Jake had been maintaining a lot of dishonesty with himself for a long time. The war, the years after, the choices he'd made and the choices he'd avoided, and the slow accumulation of a life that looked like movement, but was actually just very sophisticated standing still. Tempest didn't tolerate that. Not with his rider. He could feel it, the way horses feel tension in the hands, in the seat, in the quality of the breathing. On the third morning, Jake had come to the corral carrying something from a dream he didn't want to describe even to himself, and Tempest had refused to come to him. Had stood at the far end and looked at him with those eyes and simply waited. Jake had stood at the fence for 10 minutes trying to push the thing down to where he usually kept it, and Tempest had stood there and waited as if to say, "I can tell the difference. I've always been able to tell the difference. Don't bring that in here." Jake had turned around, walked back to the bunkhouse, sat on the edge of his cot and stayed with the thing for 20 minutes, looking at it instead of away from it, which was harder than anything he'd done in a long time. Then he'd gone back. Tempest had come to him in under a minute. He hadn't told anyone about that. But the next morning at breakfast, Catherine had looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully interpret and said, "You sleep all right?" And he'd said yes, which wasn't entirely true, and she'd looked at him another moment and let it go, which he appreciated more than he knew how to say. 10 days in the trouble started. It came in the form of a man named Dalton Reese, which was the kind of name that announces itself two hard syllables that landed like fists. Reese rode onto the Sterling Ranch on a Tuesday morning with 2 men behind him, and the particular manner of someone who has decided in advance that what he wants he will have. Jake was in the corral with Tempest when they arrived. He heard the hooves on the road and watched them come through the gate without stopping, without announcing themselves, without waiting, without the basic courtesy of stopping at the fence and asking permission. And he felt something tighten in his chest that was old and familiar and not entirely unpleasant in the way that danger sometimes isn't, when it's the kind of danger that clarifies rather than confuses. Hank came out of the barn. "Reese," he said, not a greeting. "Hank," Reese said, swinging down from his horse with the ease of a man who has always had good horses and always will. He was somewhere north of 50 broad, with a face that had been handsome once, and had decided to become imposing instead. He looked around the ranch with the proprietary interest of a man who already thinks he owns something. "Catherine around?" "I'll let her know you're here," Hank said. "No need." Reese was already walking toward the house. Hank moved to intercept. "I'll let her know," he said again, the words carrying a different weight the second time. Reese stopped, looked at Hank, looked at the barn, looked at Jake, who was still in the corral watching with Tempest standing quiet beside him. His eyes stayed on Jake a beat too long. "Who's that?" he said. "Hired man," Hank said. "Since when do you need hired men?" "Catherine tell me she was taking on someone new." "Not everything on this ranch requires your advance notice," Hank said pleasantly in the tone of a man who has been saying difficult things politely for a very long time. Reese looked at Jake again. Jake looked back. Neither of them nodded. Catherine came out of the house. Then she'd heard the horses from inside, because Catherine Sterling heard everything that happened on her property and always had. She came to the porch and looked at Reese with an expression that was not warm and not cold, but somewhere in the exact middle, the expression of a woman managing something she didn't ask for. "Dalton," she said. "Catherine." He moved toward her and took off his hat, and there was something in the gesture that was almost courtly, which made it worse, somehow the performance of manners without the substance. "You look well." "What do you need?" she said. Not rude, just direct. Reese put his hat back on and crossed his arms, the shift from courtly to business smooth and practiced. "I've been patient," he said. 14 months is patient by any measure. I wanted to give you time to grieve, to find your feet, to figure out what you're doing. I think you've had enough time." "Enough time for what exactly?" Catherine said. "To make a sensible decision about this property," Reese said. "My offer stands. Same number I put in front of Thomas 3 years ago, and I'm not going down from it. You've got debt, Catherine. You've got a horse that nobody can—" He stopped, looked toward the corral. At Jake. At Tempest, standing calm beside Jake. Something moved through his expression there and gone. "Apparently I've been given incorrect information," he said. "Apparently," Catherine said. "Doesn't change anything," Reese said, recovering smoothly. "You're still one bad season from losing this place outright. That's my concern, not yours. It becomes mine when—" "It becomes yours when I say it becomes yours," Catherine said. "And I have not said that. Not 14 months ago, not today, not any day between." She came down one step from the porch. Just one. But the gesture was deliberate. "Thomas didn't sell to you. I won't either." Reese was quiet for the moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not threatening exactly, but with the quality of a door that's been left open and now is being closed. "I'm trying to help you." "I know you believe that," Catherine said. "That doesn't make it true." The 2 men behind Reese hadn't moved or spoken. They were the kind of men who stay still until they're needed, which was its own kind of statement about what Reese was prepared for when he rode in. Jake watched all of this from the corral. He hadn't moved either. Tempest was still beside him, but the horse's attention had shifted. Those ears were forward and fixed on the group at the house, and his body had taken on a readiness that Jake recognized. Tempest read situations the way Jake read situations, and they were reading this one the same way. Reese looked at Jake one more time. "How long's he been here?" he said to Hank rather than Catherine. "Long enough," Hank said. "Where's he from?" "That's his business," Catherine said from the porch. Reese held Jake's gaze across the distance and said to Jake directly, "You'd be smart to move on when you've had enough of ranch work. This place has got uncertain prospects." He said it pleasantly conversationally, the way certain men deliver warnings dressed as advice. Jake said from the corral, "Much obliged for the opinion." That was all. Reese looked at him for another moment. Then he put his hat to Catherine, a gesture that managed to be dismissive while appearing respectful, and turned back to his horse. "Think about what I said, Catherine. The offer won't stand forever." "It doesn't need to," she said. He rode out. His men followed. The ranch held its breath until the sound of hooves faded down the road, and then it released in the particular way places do after someone uncomfortable has left everything exhaled at once, even the animals. Hank let out a long, slow breath through his nose. "He'll be back," he said. "I know," Catherine said. "He wants this ranch, Catherine. Has wanted it for 20 years. I know that too. He's not going to." "Hank!" She looked at him directly. "I know. I've always known. Thomas knew." She looked toward the corral where Jake was watching the road where Reese had disappeared. "Go back to work," she said quietly. "Everything's the same as it was this morning." Hank went back to work, but everything was not quite the same as it had been that morning, and Catherine knew it, and Jake knew it, and Tempest, who had not fully settled since Reese rode off, knew it, in whatever way horses know things that haven't happened yet. That evening after supper, Jake found Catherine at the fence of the north pasture, where she went sometimes when she was thinking. He'd been on the ranch 10 days and had already learned her patterns the way you learn the patterns of a place you're trying to understand, not deliberately, just by paying attention. He stood at the fence beside her and didn't say anything for a while. The evening was doing what evenings do in late summer, going from warm to cool in that particular way that always feels like a conversation concluding. "He's been trying to buy this ranch since before Thomas died," Catherine said without preamble, the way people talk when they've been having a conversation in their head and finally let the other person in. Thomas wouldn't sell. Reese always believed Thomas was being sentimental. He wasn't. Thomas just knew what this land was worth in ways Reese never will, because Reese measures worth in money, and Thomas measured it in other things. "What kind of other things?" Jake said. Catherine was quiet for a moment. "What you build on land matters more than the land itself," she said. "Thomas used to say, it's not about what the ground is worth. It's about what you become while you're working it." She looked at the pasture. "He built this ranch from 40 acres and a borrowed team. Spent 30 years doing it. Every fence post, every building, he put his hands on, all of it." A pause. "I'm not selling that." "No," Jake said. "You're not." She looked at him sideways. "You sound certain about that." "I am," he said. Simply. No explanation attached. Catherine absorbed that. Something about the certainty in it, not aggressive, not performing confidence, just stating a true thing, settled something in her that had been unsettled since Reese rode out that morning. "He has money," she said. "Real money. And he's right about one thing: we're stretched thin. 2 bad seasons in a row. The debt to the bank is manageable if we have a good year, but if we don't..." She stopped. "Then we'll have a good year," Jake said. "Just like that." "No," he said. "Not just like that. With a lot of work and probably some luck and possibly some things going wrong before they go right." He paused. "But yes, we'll have a good year." She looked at him fully for the first time that evening. "We," she said. He met her eyes. "If that's all right." The word hung there. We. 11 days in, and he was saying we about a ranch that wasn't his, and the remarkable thing was that it didn't sound presumptuous. It sounded accurate, like a fact that had established itself without being announced. "It's all right," Catherine said after a moment. She looked back at the pasture. He looked at the pasture too. Neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to. The twist came 3 days later, and it came from a direction no one was watching. Billy came back from a supply run to town with supplies and information in equal measure, and the information was this: Dalton Reese had been talking to the bank. Not just talking meeting. Behind closed doors with Jeremiah Cole, who was not precisely the bank, but was the closest thing to the bank that a small valley had, and who had apparently been having ongoing conversations with Reese about the Sterling property debt that had not been shared with Catherine. Hank brought this to Catherine in the kitchen, which was where serious things got discussed on the Sterling ranch, and he did it directly because Hank was not a man who dressed up bad news. "Cole's been meeting with Reese," he said. "Looks like Reese has been buying up the debt, or trying to." Catherine set down what she was holding. "How long?" "Billy says the talk as it started back in the spring. Before the challenge." "Before the challenge," Hank confirmed. Catherine stood very still. She was doing the arithmetic that a person does when they realize something has been happening under the surface of things for longer than they knew. Reese showing up not just to make an offer, but to position himself so that her options narrowed. The offer not as a first step, but as a last one, the point at which she ran out of road. "If he holds the debt," she said carefully, "and we miss a payment, he doesn't foreclose himself," Hank said. "He goes through Cole, but the result's the same. How much time do we have? Payments due in December. If we can make it, we buy ourselves another year." Catherine nodded once. Sharp and final, the nod of a woman making a decision she's going to stick to. "All right," she said. "December." "Catherine," Hank said carefully, "it's September." "I know when it is, Hank. 3 months is not a lot of—" I said I know. She looked at him. "Get Jake." Hank found Jake at the corral and relayed the message without editorial because Jake had been on the property 11 days, and Hank respected economy of words, and Jake came to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at Catherine and said, "What happened?" She told him. All of it. Clear and fast and without softening any of it. When she finished, she looked at him and waited. He was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitant quiet of someone deciding what to say. The thinking quiet of someone who has already decided and is working out the details. "Tempest," he said. She blinked. Of everything she expected him to say, that was not it. "What about him?" "His bloodline," Jake said. "What do you know about it?" "He's Thomas found him wild. We never traced it fully. I think I know what he is," Jake said. "Or close to it. The way he moves. The intelligence. The bone structure." He looked at her. "I think he might be part of the steel dust line. Old Spanish stock crossed with quarter horse. If he is, his foals would be worth considerable money." Catherine stared at him. "He's never been bred." "No, but he could be. With the right mares." Jake looked at her steadily. "You have 4 mares on this property that could work. I'd have to look at each one. And we'd need to find out for certain what Tempest is. And if you're right, then you have something Reese doesn't know you have," Jake said. "And you use it before December." The kitchen was very quiet. Hank, who had been standing in the doorway this whole time, said, "How do you know about bloodlines?" "My father," Jake said. "Wyoming, before the war." He said it the way he said most things about before factually, without going further in. Hank looked at Catherine. Catherine looked at Jake. "How certain are you?" she said. "Certain enough to say it out loud," Jake said. "Not certain enough to promise you anything until I can look at him properly, and we'd need someone who knows the lineage records." He paused. "There's a man in Santa Fe. Used to work for one of the big breeding operations before he retired. He knows more about old Spanish bloodlines than anyone I've come across. If I could get him out here—" Can you contact him? I can write him. Whether he comes is up to him. Catherine made a decision. She made it the way she made all decisions fast, complete without visible hesitation. Write him, she said. Jake wrote the letter that night. Catherine watched him at the desk. Thomas's desk, which she'd moved into the kitchen because she used it for ranch business, and the study felt too much like a room that belonged to someone who wasn't there anymore. And there was something about watching him sit at that desk and write in a careful, deliberate hand that she felt in a place she wasn't prepared to feel anything yet. She went to bed before he finished. The letter went out with Billy on the morning run. And the ranch went on because ranches go on with the added weight of a December deadline, and a theory about a horse's bloodline, and a man named Dalton Reese, somewhere in the valley, making plans that he believed were already concluded. He was wrong about that. But nobody had told him yet. The next 10 days were different from the first 10. The first 10 had been about Jake finding his place on the ranch. The next 10 were about the ranch finding out what Jake was actually made of. Because Hank, who had moved from watchful to provisional, now moved to something closer to deliberate, he started assigning Jake the harder work, not to break him. Hank wasn't that kind of man. But because the situation required knowing what a person was capable of, and the only way to know that was to ask the question, Jake fixed the north fence line in 2 days, working from first light to last, which was a job that had been sitting undone for 6 weeks, because it was long and thankless and required sustained focus. He rebuilt the gate on the east pasture, which had been hanging wrong for so long that the horses had learned to push it a certain way, and the hands had just let them. He worked the 4 mares one by one in the evenings after his morning work with Tempest, with a patience and technical skill that made old Sam stop what he was doing and watch. Sam had forgotten more about horses than most men ever knew, and watching Jake work, he said to Hank one evening, "That man's been trained by someone serious." "His father, he says," Hank said. "Must have been some father," Sam said. It was, and it wasn't. Jake's father had been serious about horses and had also been serious about drinking, which had been serious in a different and damaging way, and the ranch in Wyoming had eventually become a creditor's asset rather than a family one, which was one of the things Jake carried that he hadn't told anyone. He'd learned horses from a man he loved and had also watched that man lose everything. The lesson had 2 sides to it, and he'd spent years trying to hold both without letting one cancel the other. Tempest seemed to know about this too. Not literally, but horses know what a person is sitting with, and what Tempest seemed to know about Jake was that Jake was someone who understood loss from the inside. And that knowledge, whatever the horse made of it, was what allowed Tempest to do something he'd done with only one other human being in his life. He started following Jake, not in the corral, outside it. When Jake moved through the property doing other work, Tempest would go to the fence line nearest to where Jake was working and stand there tracking him. The other hands noticed it before Jake did, and when Billy made a comment about it at supper, Jake just said, "He's checking," and went back to eating, and the way he said it, like it was a completely natural thing, a horse keeping track of a person, made Billy decide not to ask the follow-up question he'd been about to ask. The letter came back from Santa Fe 12 days after Jake sent it. He brought it to Catherine unopened, which she registered, and which meant something to her, the deliberate gesture of not reading something that concerned her before she could. She opened it at the kitchen table with Jake standing nearby and Hank in the doorway. The man's name was Cornelius Webb. He was 73 years old and retired and had very precise handwriting, and he wrote that he was not in the habit of making long journeys anymore, but that the description Jake had provided of the horse's physical characteristics and behavioral patterns was of sufficient interest that he would make an exception. He would arrive by the end of the month. Catherine set the letter down. Hank said, "Well." Jake said nothing, but Catherine looked at him, and what she saw in his face was not triumph. It was something quieter than that. Something careful. Like a person who knows that a door has opened, but is aware that there's a long hallway behind it. "He might get here and tell us Tempest is nothing special," Catherine said. "He might," Jake said, "and then we're back where we were." "Yes," Jake said. But we'd know. And knowing something for certain, even if it's not what you hoped, is better than not knowing. He paused. That's been my experience. Catherine looked at him for a moment. Then she folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer. End of the month, she said. Yes, ma'am. That gives us 6 weeks to December, assuming Webb says what I hope he says. I know. Is that enough time? Jake considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. It's enough time if everything works, he said. And if some things don't work, we figure out what's next. He looked at her steadily. That's all anyone can do. Catherine looked at him. The kitchen was quiet. Hank was in the doorway. Outside somewhere, Tempest was at whatever fence line was nearest to where Jake had last been working. All right, she said in the tone that meant she'd made peace with what was in front of her. Not resigned. Resolved. She went back to her accounts at the desk. Jake went back to work. But later, much later, when the hands were asleep and the ranch was quiet, in the deep particular way of places that work hard and rest harder. Catherine sat at Thomas's desk and took out the letter from Cornelius Webb and read it again. Not for information. She'd absorbed the information the first time. She read it because of the thing Jake had said, knowing something for certain is better than not knowing, and because she realized sitting in the quiet that this applied to more things than a horse's bloodline. She'd been not knowing for 14 months. Not knowing what she was going to do with this ranch. Not knowing how she was going to hold on to it. Not knowing what it meant to be Catherine Sterling without Thomas Sterling beside her, because she'd been one half of that particular whole for 22 years, and the loss of it had left her feeling structurally unsound in a way she hadn't admitted to anyone. Not knowing, most recently, what to do with the particular feeling that had taken up residence in her chest when she watched Jake Morrison move through her husband's ranch like he'd always been there. Like the land recognized him. Like Tempest recognized him. Like something about the whole situation had the quality of an answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. She folded the letter, put it back in the drawer, sat there in the quiet for a while. Then she pressed Thomas's leather glove against her chest. It was always in the desk drawer, always the first thing her hand found when she opened it. And she said quietly to the room, to the desk, to whatever of Thomas remained in this house that she hadn't been able to let go of. I think something is happening. I don't know what it is yet, but I think you'd understand it. The house was quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the corral, and Catherine Sterling, for the second time in 14 months, let herself be uncertain about something without trying immediately to resolve it. That was in its own way the beginning of something. She just didn't know yet how far it would go. Cornelius Webb arrived on a Thursday, which felt appropriate, because Thursday is neither the beginning nor the end of anything. It is the middle, the place where things are decided, where the weight of a week either breaks or holds. He came in on the afternoon stage from Santa Fe, and Jake met him at the road because Catherine had quietly suggested it and Jake had gone without needing it explained. Webb was 73 and looked every year of it, and also looked like those years had been spent entirely outdoors doing things that mattered, which gave him a particular kind of authority that had nothing to do with how he dressed or how much money he had. He was thin in the way of men who have never been interested in food as anything beyond fuel, with hands that were enormous relative to the rest of him, and eyes that went straight to the horses before they went anywhere else. He stepped off the stage, looked at Jake, and said, "You, Morrison?" "Yes, sir," Jake said. "Your letter was good," Webb said. "Specific. Most people who write me about horses describe them the way they describe a sunset, pretty words that don't tell me anything." He picked up his bag. "You described a horse. Where is he?" "Ranch is about a mile," Jake said. "We've got a wagon." "I'd rather walk," Webb said. "Tell me about him on the way." So Jake told him. Everything, and in the order it mattered, not the story of the challenge, not the drama of 25 men thrown, but the specifics. The bone structure, the movement patterns, the intelligence, the way Tempest processed new situations, not with panic, but with calculation. The particular angle of the hindquarters when he ran, the depth of the chest, the proportion of the cannon bone to the pastern. He talked with the precision of someone who had been looking at this horse every day for 3 weeks and storing information without knowing exactly when he'd need it. Webb listened without interrupting. When they reached the ranch gate, Webb stopped walking. He'd seen Tempest from the road. The horse was at the far fence doing what he did when Jake was gone, which was tracking the direction Jake had disappeared in and waiting. Webb stood at the gate and looked at the horse for a full minute without speaking. Then he said, "How did you find this horse?" "I didn't," Jake said. "The horse found me." Webb looked at him. Something moved behind those eyes. Then he said, "Take me to him." Catherine was on the porch when they came through. She came down and introduced herself with the directness she brought to everything, and Webb took off his hat, a real gesture, not a performative one, and said, "Mrs. Sterling, your ranch hand writes a good letter. Let's hope his eye for horses is as good as his eye for words." "So do I," Catherine said. Webb went to the corral. What happened next was something Jake watched with close attention because he understood what Webb was doing in a way the other hands didn't. Webb didn't go inside the fence. He stood outside and looked. For 15 minutes, he stood there in silence and looked at Tempest. And Tempest, who responded to most new humans with visible disdain, stood at the far end of the corral and looked back. Not threatening, not retreating, just looking. Two creatures assessing each other with a seriousness that excluded everything else. Then Webb said very quietly, "Open the gate." "He doesn't take to strangers," Hank said from behind them. "Open the gate," Webb said again pleasantly, without looking away from the horse. Jake opened the gate. Webb walked in. Tempest's ears went back. Webb kept walking slow and direct, not the sideways approach of someone being cautious, but the straight line of someone who has decided what they're doing and isn't interested in appearing to do something else. He stopped 6 feet from Tempest and put his hands in his pockets and stood there. Tempest stared at him. Webb stared back. Jake at the fence held himself very still. After 2 minutes, 2 full minutes of a standoff that had the quality of a conversation happening in a frequency nobody else could hear, Tempest dropped his head. Not in submission, in acknowledgement. A specific gesture that Jake recognized because he'd only seen Tempest make it once before. Webb put his hand on Tempest's jaw and turned the horse's head, looking at the eye. Looked at the ear. Ran his hand down the neck. Moved to the shoulder, the chest, the foreleg, working with the efficiency of a man who has done this 10,000 times and doesn't need to perform expertise because he simply has it. Tempest stood and let him. Behind Jake, Billy whispered, "How is he doing that?" Jake said, "He's not doing anything. He's just being someone the horse decided to trust." "How'd the horse decide that in 2 minutes?" Jake said, "I don't know, but Tempest always knows." Webb spent 40 minutes with the horse. When he came out of the corral, he didn't say anything immediately. He went to the water trough and washed his hands and dried them on his jacket, and looked at the middle distance the way a person looks when they're organizing a conclusion. Then he turned to Catherine and said, "Where did your husband find this horse?" "Southwest border of our property," Catherine said. 6 years ago, half wild, half starved." "Had he been running with any other horses?" "One, a mare, gray. Thomas tried to catch her too, but she wouldn't come in." Webb nodded slowly. "I need to look at his back feet again," he said. "And I'll need a good look in the morning light, but—" He paused. The pause had weight. "Mrs. Sterling, I believe what you have in that corral is the direct descendant of a stallion called El Rey Oscuro. Dark King. He was a steel dust cross, pure Spanish barb through his sire quarter horse through the dam, and he was the finest horse I saw in 40 years of this work." Another pause. "He disappeared from a ranch in New Mexico 11 years ago. Nobody ever found him. I assumed he died." The corral was very quiet. "Or," Webb said, "he ran, and somewhere in those hills he left something behind." Catherine said carefully, "What does that mean in practical terms?" Webb looked at her. "It means that horse is not just valuable. It means he is potentially the most important breeding stallion in this part of the country." He looked at Jake. "Your instinct was right. Better than right. He looked back at Catherine. If we can document the lineage, and I believe we can. I kept records on El Rey Oscuro myself for the ranch he belonged to. Then you have an asset that changes the situation of this property considerably. Catherine absorbed this. The way she always absorbed things completely without visible reaction, processing it somewhere interior before it showed on her face. Hank said slowly. How considerably? Webb said. A documented descendant of El Rey Oscuro with Tempest's physical characteristics and apparent temperament. He paused. You're looking at breeding fees that would pay your debt 3 times over, in the first season alone if we do this right. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when something large and previously impossible becomes possible so quickly that the mind needs a moment to catch up with it. Billy said, Lord Almighty, nobody told him to be quiet. Jake looked at Catherine. Catherine was looking at the corral, where Tempest had returned to the fence nearest to Jake and was standing there in his habitual posture of watching and waiting with no awareness that his existence had just shifted everything. You said if we do this right? Catherine said to Webb. What does right look like? Documentation first, Webb said. I'll write up what I know about El Rey Oscuro's line, and we'll match it against what we can observe here. Then you'll need to make the right introductions, not to every buyer who comes along, but to the right buyers. Men with serious mares and serious intentions. He paused. And you'll need to control who knows about this and when. Information like this in the wrong hands. He looked toward the road. Gets complicated. Jake understood what he meant. So did Catherine. So did Hank. Dalton Reese. If Reese found out what Tempest was worth before Catherine had the documentation in hand, before the agreements were signed, and the position was secured, he'd move. He'd move fast with money and lawyers and the machinery of a man who'd been waiting for a lever and had just been handed one. How long for the documentation? Jake said. If my records are where I think they are, Webb said 2 weeks, maybe 3. We have until December, Catherine said. That's enough time, Webb said. If we're careful. We'll be careful, Catherine said. It was not a question or a reassurance. It was a statement of fact delivered in the tone of a woman who has decided something and is now simply moving forward. Webb was given the spare room in the house, which nobody had used since a cousin of Thomas's had visited 3 years ago. The hands were told he was a consultant on horse management, which was true enough. Nobody was told anything about El Rey Oscuro, or bloodlines, or breeding fees, which required Hank to have a quiet word with Billy about the consequences of sharing information prematurely, a word that Billy received with unusual solemnity. That night, Jake sat on the porch after everyone else had gone in. He was doing the thing he did when he needed to think sitting still and letting his mind work without pushing it. The information of the day had a weight to it that he was sorting through. Not the practical weight, he understood the practical implications clearly. The other weight. The kind that came from realizing you'd been right about something that mattered. That the instinct you'd followed across 40 miles of road and into a stranger's corral had been right in ways you hadn't even known to hope for. The door opened and Catherine came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair, Thomas's chair, which she'd brought to the porch, and which she used now, which Jake had noticed and registered as something significant in the quiet accounting he kept of who Catherine Sterling was and how she moved through her own life. She handed him a cup. He took it. They sat in the dark for a while. Then Catherine said, "You knew." "I suspected," he said. "There's a difference. A big one," he said. "Knowing something and suspecting it, the distance between them is where you can make a fool of yourself." She considered that. "You didn't say anything until you were sure enough to say it." "No, Thomas was like that," she said. She said it quietly without the careful distance she usually maintained around Thomas's name in conversation, and Jake heard the difference and stayed very still. He didn't speak on things until he'd thought them through completely. People mistook it for slowness. It wasn't slowness. It was respect for the thing he was thinking about. Jake said, "I know that kind of thinking." "Yes," Catherine said. "I can see that you do." The night was warm enough to stay in and cool enough to be comfortable, And the particular quality of silence between them in that moment was not the silence of two people who don't have anything to say. It was the silence of two people who have enough to say that they're being careful about where to start. Catherine started. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," Jake said. "I'll answer what I can. Why did you come here, really?" She looked at him. "Not the story about hearing the challenge. I believe that's how it started. But you could have heard about it and kept going. Most people hear a story and keep going. You turned around and rode 40 miles. A pause. Why? Jake was quiet for a moment, not avoiding, reaching. "I was empty," he said finally. "Not sad, not angry, just nothing. For a long time. The kind of nothing that gets so familiar you stop noticing it, which is the most dangerous kind." He looked at his coffee cup. "And then I heard about this horse that nobody could ride, and this woman who kept putting the notice back up every time someone took it down, and something—" He paused. Something moved, inside, a place that hadn't moved in a long time. Catherine was listening in the way she listened fully without preparing her response while he was still talking. "I didn't think I'd be able to ride him," Jake said. "I thought I'd come and watch, and maybe it'd be enough just to see. To be near something that was still alive in that particular way, wild and serious and—" He stopped. "And," Catherine said. "Real," Jake said. "I wanted to be near something real." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "Thomas used to say," she said very carefully, "that Tempest was the most honest living thing he'd ever known. Because a horse doesn't perform. He responds. Whatever you bring to him is what he gives back." "That's true," Jake said. "I think—" Catherine said, then stopped. "Go ahead," he said quietly. She looked at him. In the dark, with the night around them and the ranch quiet and the coffee warm in their hands, she looked at him with the look that wasn't the measuring one and wasn't the careful one and was something else, something she hadn't shown anyone in 14 months. "I think you're the most honest person who's come to this ranch in a very long time," she said, "including the ones who were already here." Jake didn't say anything, but something in his face changed. The held thing. The careful distance he maintained from his own interior shifted just slightly, like a door that's been locked a long time, moving on its hinges. "Mrs. Sterling," he said. "Catherine," she said. "If we're being honest." A pause. "Catherine," he said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know what I'm doing here past the work," he said. "I'm not saying that to be... I'm saying it because it's true, and I think you deserve that. I came for a horse and stayed for a ranch, and I don't know what comes next, and I'm not someone who's good at—" He stopped. "I've been moving a long time. I don't know how to stop well." "I've been stopped a long time," Catherine said. "I don't know how to move yet." They looked at each other. "Maybe that works out," Jake said quietly. "Maybe it does," Catherine said. She stood up, picked up her cup, looked at him one more time in the dark. "Good night, Jake," she said. His name, not Mr. Morrison, not the hired man. His name. "Good night, Catherine," he said. She went inside. He sat on the porch for another hour, looking at the dark, and for the first time in longer than he could track. The dark looked like something other than empty. It looked like something that had things in it he hadn't found yet. The second twist came at the end of Webb's first week, and it came with the speed and impact of something that had been building in the dark while everyone was looking at the light. Reese knew. Not everything. But enough. Hank brought it to Jake first, which was itself a shift in the hierarchy of the ranch that neither of them acknowledged directly, and Hank's face was the face of a man delivering news he'd been dreading. "Roy Briggs," Hank said. "He came back through town, had dinner at the saloon, talked to some people." He paused. Talked about Webb. Said he'd seen an old man arrive at the ranch, asked around Santa Fe, found out who he was. Jake went very still. Briggs connected Webb to bloodline work. "Apparently Briggs isn't as dumb as he acts," Hank said. "And Reese." Reese had lunch with Cole yesterday, Hank said. 2 hours. After Briggs came through. Jake stood up from where he'd been sitting on the fence rail and looked toward the road and thought fast. Not panicked, fast. The same way he'd thought in situations during the war, where the ground changed under him and the plan was suddenly wrong, and there was no time to mourn the old plan, only to make a new one. "How long does Webb need?" he said. He told Catherine possibly another week, maybe less. "Then we need to move like we have 3 days," Jake said. "Because if Reese goes to Cole and Cole moves on the debt." "Before Webb's documentation is complete," Hank said. "Before Catherine has any agreements in place." "She has nothing to negotiate with," Jake said, "and Reese knows that." They looked at each other. "I need to talk to Catherine," Jake said. "She's with Webb," Hank said. "They've been in the barn since breakfast." Jake went to the barn. Catherine and Webb looked up when he came in, and whatever they read in his face made them both stop what they were doing. Catherine said, "What happened?" Jake told her, "Clean and fast. Briggs the saloon, Cole the lunch the timeline." When he finished, Catherine looked at Webb. Webb said, "How much of the documentation do we have?" "Enough to establish the lineage," Webb said. "What we don't have is the formal certification from the registry. That requires submitting to the records office in Denver. It'll take—" "How long?" Catherine said. "In the normal course, 6 to 8 weeks." "We don't have 6 to 8 weeks," Catherine said. "No," Webb said. "But I know the registrar." He paused. "Personally, we were at the same operation for 5 years. If I write to him directly explain the situation—" He stopped. "He might be able to expedite. I can't promise it." "Write the letter," Catherine said. "Today. Right now." "Catherine," Jake said. She looked at him. "There's something else we can do, while we wait." "What?" "We make the first move before Reese does," Jake said. "We don't wait for him to come to us. We go to Cole ourselves. Today. With what we have. Not to negotiate, just to put on record that this ranch has assets in development that Cole isn't aware of. That changes his calculus." Catherine looked at him steadily. "You think Cole doesn't already know which way his bread is buttered?" "I think Cole is a businessman," Jake said, "and a businessman who knows there's something valuable he hasn't accounted for yet might pause before moving on behalf of someone else." "Or he tells Reese tonight, and Reese moves faster," Catherine said. "That's the risk," Jake said. He met her eyes. "I think it's worth taking, but it's your ranch." The room held the decision for a moment. Then Catherine untied her apron and hung it on the nail by the barn door and said, "Hank, get the wagon. Jake, come with me." She looked at Webb. "Write the letter." They were in Jeremiah Cole's office by 2 in the afternoon. Cole was a small, precise man who wore his anxiety the way some men wear their best suit visibly on special occasions and otherwise kept pressed and put away. He was clearly not expecting them, which was an advantage, and the fact that Jake came with Catherine, rather than one of the hands, was a statement Cole received and processed without commenting on. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, arranging papers on his desk that didn't need arranging. "What can I do for you?" "You can listen," Catherine said, sitting down without being invited and looking at Cole with the direct, even gaze she brought to everything. "I know you've been meeting with Dalton Reese about our debt." Cole opened his mouth. "Don't," Catherine said. "Don't tell me it's just business conversations or routine financial discussions or anything else that's technically true and practically misleading. I know what it is. Thomas knew what Reese wanted for 20 years. I've known since he died." She paused. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I'm here to give you information that changes the picture." Cole looked at Jake. Jake didn't look away. Cole looked back at Catherine. "What information?" "This ranch has an asset that neither you nor Reese has accounted for," Catherine said. "Our Stallion Tempest is a documented descendant of a bloodline that makes him one of the most valuable breeding animals in this region. We have an expert on the property right now completing documentation. We have interest from buyers in Santa Fe and will have formal breeding agreements in place before December." She paused. "Before the payment date." Cole was very still. If you move on this debt before that documentation is complete, Catherine said, you will have done so in a way that deprives this ranch of an asset we were in the process of developing. I'm not a lawyer, Jeremiah, but I believe that has implications. She let that sit for a moment. More importantly, when it becomes known what this horse is worth, and it will become known, people will ask who held this debt and whether they acted appropriately. Cole looked at his desk, at his hands, at the window. Then he said very carefully, how confident are you in this valuation? Completely, Catherine said. Cole was quiet for a long moment. The office clock ticked. Outside, a horse went by in the street. Jake sat very still and let Catherine do the work because she was doing it perfectly, and he understood when to take up space and when to leave it to someone who owned it. I'll need to see the documentation when it's complete, Cole said finally. You'll have it, Catherine said. And until then? He stopped. Chose his words carefully. I have certain obligations in the existing arrangements that I can't simply set aside. I'm not asking you to set anything aside, Catherine said. I'm asking you to do nothing until December, which was always the arrangement. Cole looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. Until December. Catherine stood. Jake stood. She put her hand on Cole's desk briefly, not aggressive, just grounding the gesture of a woman establishing that she was real and present, and not to be forgotten, and said, Thank you, Jeremiah. They were back in the wagon and on the road before Jake said anything. That was impressive, he said. That was necessary, Catherine said. Then, after a moment, was it enough? It bought us time, Jake said, which is what we needed. And if Reese finds out we went to Cole, he'll know we know, Jake said, which means he knows we're not waiting to be cornered. He paused. Men like Reese count on people being passive, being afraid of them. You just told him through Cole that you're not. Catherine looked at the road ahead. Thomas never went to Cole, she said quietly, not quite to Jake. Thomas didn't have to, Jake said. The situation was different. No, Catherine said. I think Thomas was too proud. She said it with the particular mix of love and clarity that people reach when they've had enough time to see someone they loved completely, not just the good sides. He would have found another way. He usually did. But there were things he wouldn't do because they felt like admitting weakness. A pause. I don't have that luxury. It's not a luxury, Jake said. Pride isn't a luxury. No? Catherine agreed. But sometimes it's a liability. They rode in silence for a while. Then Catherine said, I need to tell you something. He waited. When Thomas died, she said, I spent the first 3 months convinced I was going to lose this ranch. Not because of the debt, because of me. Because I didn't know if I was enough, if I could hold all of it together without him. She paused. And then I put up that notice about Tempest. And I know people thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had a little. But what I was really doing... She stopped. You were testing yourself, Jake said. Not the men. She turned to look at him. You needed to know, Jake said, if you were still capable of doing something that mattered. And the answer was yes. Every time someone took the notice down, you put it back up. That was your answer. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the road. Yes, she said quietly. That's exactly what it was. They didn't say anything else the rest of the way home. But when they arrived at the ranch, and Hank came out to meet them and asked how it went, Catherine said, well, in a tone that meant something more than the word, and Jake went to the corral where Tempest was waiting at the fence and put his hand on the horse's neck, and stood there in the late afternoon with the feeling of a man who has been moving for a very long time, and has finally, in the most unexpected place, found something solid enough to stand on. He didn't name it yet, but he felt it. And the horse beside him was still and warm and real, which was everything which had always been. Everything, which was the only thing Jake Morrison had ever really needed, and hadn't known how to find, until a black stallion in a stranger's corral had looked at him from across a fence and recognized something that Jake himself had almost stopped believing was there. Webb's letter to Denver went out the same evening. They returned from Cole's office, carried by Billy, on the fastest horse on the property, with instructions to make the stage connection before nightfall. Webb had written it by hand at the kitchen table in an hour, and when he finished, he looked at Catherine and said, "I've told him everything. If Marcus still trusts my eye, and he has no reason not to, he'll move on this." He paused. "Marcus Ellery is the most meticulous man I've ever known. When he certifies something, it stays certified. No one disputes it. Not even lawyers working for men with money." Catherine said, "How long?" "I asked for 10 days, Webb said. "I've never asked him for a favor in 30 years of knowing him. He'll know it's serious. 10 days. They had 11 before the situation with Reese became critical by Jake's calculation, and his calculations had been right so far. 11 days, and a man in Denver who trusted Webb's eye. Catherine nodded once and went to bed, and the house settled into the particular silence of a place where everyone is awake in the dark, thinking about the same thing without saying so. Jake was at the corral before sunrise. He didn't go inside. He just stood at the fence and let Tempest come to him, which the horse did, and they stood together in the pre-dawn, in the way they'd been standing together for weeks now. Two creatures who had found in each other something the world had not otherwise offered them. Jake put his forehead against the horse's neck and stood there and didn't think about anything specific. Just breathed. Just existed in the one place he'd found where existing felt like enough. "You scared?" he said very quietly to the horse. Tempest breathed against his shoulder. "Me neither," Jake said. "Well, maybe a little." The first 3 days of waiting were the hardest kind, the kind where nothing happens and everything is happening underneath the surface. Reese didn't come. Cole sent no messages. The ranch operated the way it always did, which was with the sustained, unglamorous labor that ranches require, regardless of what else is going on. Fences, animals, feed, water. The 10,000 small tasks that hold a working property together, and that Catherine had been doing largely alone for 14 months, and was now doing with 8 people who had found their rhythm. Jake noticed the rhythm. It had changed since he'd arrived quietly, and without anyone announcing it. The hands worked differently when someone who knew what they were doing was working alongside them, not directing, not performing authority, just working with competence and consistency. Hank had stopped being the sole center of gravity for the hired hands' morale. The weight had distributed itself, which made the whole structure stronger, without anyone having to say so. On the 4th day, Reese sent a letter. It came addressed to Catherine and delivered by one of his men, who didn't dismount when he handed it to Hank, which was itself a statement. Hank brought it to Catherine in the kitchen, and she opened it at the table with Jake and Webb present, and read it without her expression changing. Then she set it down and pushed it to the center of the table. Jake read it. It was 3 paragraphs. The first established that Reese was aware of certain developments at the Sterling Ranch involving a specialist from Santa Fe. The second noted that this awareness had prompted him to consult with his own experts regarding livestock valuation, and that any claims about the value of the Sterling Stallion would naturally require independent verification before they could be considered in any financial discussion. The third paragraph made an offer. Not the original offer. Higher. Considerably higher. And with a deadline of 7 days. Jake set the letter down. "He's panicking," Jake said. "He's not panicking," Catherine said. "He's accelerating." "Same thing from different positions," Jake said. "He knows something is happening here that he doesn't control. He raised his offer because he's trying to close this before he finds out exactly what he's dealing with." He looked at her. "This letter is good news." "It's a threat with better numbers," Catherine said. "Yes," Jake said. "And a man who's certain of his position doesn't offer better numbers. He waits." He paused. "He's not certain anymore." Webb picked up the letter, read it, set it back down. 7 days, he said. "That's actually helpful. If Marcus moves the way I think he will, we'll have certification in 10. Reese is drawing a deadline 3 days too early. He doesn't know that, Hank said from the doorway. No, Webb said. He doesn't. Catherine looked at the letter for a moment longer. Then she said, I'm not responding. Everyone looked at her. If I respond, I'm negotiating, she said. I'm not negotiating, I'm waiting. She picked up the letter and put it in the desk drawer next to Thomas's glove and Webb's letter from Denver and the account books that told the story of this ranch in numbers. She closed the drawer. 7 days. Fine, let them pass. Reese's man, still on his horse outside, eventually gave up waiting for a reply and rode away. The silence he left behind felt for the first time like advantage. The 5th day brought something nobody expected. Pete Dawson rode in. Not with aggression, not with Reese's manner, or the entitlement of a man who believes he owns what he's come to collect. Pete Dawson rode in slowly and stopped at the fence and took his hat off and held it in front of him, and when Hank came out, Pete said, I'd like to speak to Mrs. Sterling if she's willing. He said it carefully, with the care of a man who knows he's not owed a conversation and is asking for one anyway. Catherine came out and looked at him from the porch. Pete, she said, not warm, not cold, neutral. Mrs. Sterling, he said, I've been hearing things in town, about Reese, and about what he's about, what's being planned. He stopped reassembling his words. I came to offer something, for what it's worth. He looked at his hat. I know I was one of the men who tried to ride your horse. I know I wasn't kind about it afterward. I said things that weren't fair. He paused. And I've been watching what's been happening here since that Morrison fellow arrived, and I wanted you to know there are men in this valley who aren't with Reese, who think what he's doing is wrong. He looked up. If you need witnesses to anything, or character, or just people who'll say publicly that they know what this ranch is and what you've built here, I'd stand up and say that. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Jake, who had come around the side of the barn and was listening from a distance, stayed where he was. Then Catherine came down from the porch and walked to Pete Dawson's horse and looked up at him and said, Why? Pete met her eyes. Because I've got daughters, he said simply. And I want to be someone they'd be proud of. Took me a while to figure out that meant starting with what was in front of me. He paused. I'm sorry I called your horse wrong, Mrs. Sterling. He wasn't wrong. I was. Catherine looked at him for another long moment. Get down, she said. Have some coffee. Pete got down. He stayed 2 hours. By the time he left, there were 3 names on a list that Catherine had written in her careful schoolhouse handwriting, Pete Dawson, and 2 others he'd vouched for men who would speak publicly about the Sterling Ranch's reputation and character if it came to that. It was not a legal document. But in a valley that ran on reputation, the way other places ran on law, it was something. Jake waited until Pete had ridden out, and then came to the kitchen and said, Did you know he'd come? No, Catherine said. What made you let him in? She thought about it. He took his hat off, she said. And he didn't dismount until I invited him to. She paused. Thomas used to say you could judge a man by whether he remembered the small courtesies when he didn't have to. She looked at the list on the table. Pete remembered. Jake looked at the list. This could matter, he said. It might not come to that, Catherine said. No, he agreed. But if it does, we have it. He looked at her. She looked at him. And in the look was everything that had accumulated between them over 6 weeks, every morning at the fence, and every supper at the long table, and every conversation on the porch in the dark, and every decision made together without it being formally decided that they made decisions together. All of it was in that look, present and warm, and not yet spoken, because some things take longer to say than they take to be true. Jake looked away first. I'm going to work the mares this afternoon, he said. Webb wants to observe. All right, Catherine said. He left. She sat at the table with the list and Thomas's glove in the drawer 6 inches from her hand, and felt the particular texture of a life reorganizing itself around something new. It was not comfortable. It was not uncomfortable either. It was simply real. The most real thing she'd felt since the most real thing she'd known had ended. The letter from Denver came on the 9th day. It came not by stage, but by private rider, which meant Marcus Ellery had sent it fast on purpose, which meant he understood the urgency Webb had communicated. Jake saw the rider come through the gate and was at the house before the man had dismounted. He held his position at the porch steps while Catherine received the envelope and opened it with the precision of someone who has been waiting for something and intends to do it correctly when it arrives. She read it. Her face did not change. She read it a second time. Then she handed it to Webb, who was standing beside her, and Webb read it and made a sound that was not quite a word, but had the quality of deep satisfaction in it. The sound of a man who has trusted his own eye for 50 years and has just been told once again that he was right. He handed it back to Catherine. She handed it to Jake. Jake read it. Marcus Ellery, Registrar of the Western Livestock Heritage Registry. Denver, Colorado, certified in formal and precise language that, based on the documentation provided by Cornelius Webb, supplemented by physical characteristic records and geographic range data, the stallion identified as Tempest residing at the Sterling Ranch in Dry Creek Valley was with high confidence a direct male descendant of El Rey Oscuro, registered stallion Steel Dust Barb Cross, whose line was the most sought-after breeding bloodline in the Southwest Registry. The certification was subject to a final in-person assessment, which Ellery indicated he would conduct personally within the month, but for the purposes of preliminary agreements and financial documentation, this letter constituted official notice of heritage status. Jake lowered the letter. "That's it," he said. "That's it," Webb said. Catherine stood very still. Then she said, "Hank?" Hank was in the doorway where he spent a significant portion of his life. "I need you to ride to Cole's office. Tell him I'll be there tomorrow morning with documentation. Tell him to make sure his schedule is clear." Hank looked at the letter in Jake's hand. "Is it good?" he said. "It's very good," Jake said. Hank made a sound remarkably similar to the one Webb had made. Then he got his horse. That evening the ranch had a different quality to it. Not celebratory, nothing was finished yet. But the specific tension of the past 2 weeks had shifted from dread to something more like readiness. The kind of readiness that comes when you've done the work and made the preparations, and now it's time to find out if they hold. After supper, Billy, who had been sitting on his best behavior for 2 weeks and had the look of a man about to burst, said, "So are we rich now?" Jake said, "The ranch is in a better position." "How much better?" "Better enough," Jake said. "Don't get ahead of it." Billy subsided, but he was smiling. He'd been smiling for an hour. Old Sam said nothing. But he raised his coffee cup slightly in the direction of no one in particular, which from Sam was equivalent to a speech. Jake went to the porch after the others went in. He'd barely settled when the door opened, and Catherine came out with 2 cups, same as before, and sat in Thomas's chair, same as before, and handed him his coffee, same as before, and the repetition of it. The small domestic ritual that had grown between them without either of them deciding to grow it struck Jake with a force he hadn't anticipated. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you something?" "Yes," she said. "When I rode into this valley," he said, "I had nothing. I don't mean money. I mean I had nothing that felt like mine. No direction that felt chosen rather than defaulted to. No reason to be anywhere in particular." He paused. "I'm telling you this, not because I want your sympathy. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what this place has been." Catherine was listening. "This ranch," he said. "You, Tempest. The work." He looked at his hands. "For the first time in years, I've been somewhere that felt like somewhere, not just a place I was passing through." He paused. "I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say without it sounding like something it might not be ready to be yet." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Jake." Her voice was steady and sure. "Yes," he said. "You stopped running," she said. "I watched you do it. Not all at once, gradually, the way a person really stops something. Not a decision you make once, but 100 small decisions every morning to stay. She looked at him. I saw it happen. He met her eyes. I stopped being stopped, she said. Somewhere in the last 6 weeks, I stopped being a woman who was standing still and waiting for life to make sense again, and started being a woman who was living in it. She paused. I watched that happen too. The night was warm and quiet, and the ranch breathed around them the way a living thing breathes steadily deeply in the rhythm of something that has found its pace. Jake said, Catherine. Yes, she said. I'd like to stay, he said. Not as a hired hand. I mean, I'll do the work, all of it, as long as there's work to do. But I'd like to stay in the way that means something more than employment. He held her gaze. If that's something you can consider. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Thomas would have liked you, she said. It was not a deflection. It was the most direct thing she could have said because it meant, I know who you are, and I am not confused about it, and I am not replacing something. I am beginning something. Jake understood it exactly. I hope so, he said quietly. He would have liked the way you listened, she said. The way you let the horse come to you instead of going after him. The way you... She stopped. The way you saw what this place needed before I told you. You built something worth seeing, Jake said. Thomas built it, she said. You kept it, Jake said. That's not less, that's different, and it's not less. Catherine looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, all right, in the tone that meant she'd made her peace with something not resolved. It entirely, not sealed. It closed, but made her peace with the fact that it was open, and that open was all right. That open was in fact the point. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his on the arm of the chair. Not dramatically, not tentatively, just placed it there. Warm and certain and real. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that until the stars were full and the coffee was cold, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying. The meeting with Cole happened the next morning, and it happened the way things happen when the ground has already shifted, and the meeting is just the formality of acknowledging it. Cole read Ellery's certification letter twice, with the careful attention of a man recalculating. Then he read it a third time. Then he set it on his desk and looked at Catherine across it and said, this changes the valuation of the property considerably. Yes, Catherine said, it does. Reese's offer is irrelevant, Catherine said. I won't be selling. We'll be making December's payment from the first breeding agreements, which we expect to have in place within the month. She paused. I'd like that noted in our account. Cole noted it. When they left his office, Jake said, how do you feel? Catherine said, like I can breathe. A pause. Like I couldn't breathe for 14 months and just now noticed. Yeah, Jake said. I know something about that. She looked at him sideways. The look had warmth in it. Not performed warmth. Real warmth, the kind that's been building in a cold place for a long time, and finally has room. Reese arrived at the ranch 2 days later. He didn't send a man this time. He came himself, which told Jake everything about his state of mind. A man who sends messengers is in control. A man who comes himself has lost it and is trying to get it back. He came alone, which was the other tell. Catherine met him at the fence. Not the porch. The fence. Jake stood 6 feet behind her and to the left, which was not an aggressive position, but was a present one, and Hank was visible at the barn door, which was also not accidental. Reese looked at the setup. Understood it. Catherine, he said. Dalton, she said. I heard about the certification. Good, she said. Then this is a shorter conversation. Reese looked at her for a moment. The face that had been imposing had something different in it now, not defeat exactly, but the reconfiguration of a man who has aimed at something for a long time and is adjusting to the fact that it has moved. I want you to know, he said carefully, that my interest in this ranch was always Dalton, Catherine said. Don't. He stopped. You wanted the land, she said. You've wanted it for 20 years. I understand that. It's good land, and you're a man who wants good things. But it was never going to be yours, and I think somewhere you knew that." She paused. Thomas knew it. He didn't say it unkindly. He just knew it. Reese was quiet. "The offer is closed," Catherine said. "The debt will be serviced. The ranch is not in question." She looked at him steadily. "If you want to do business in this valley without this between us, I'm willing to let what's past be past. If you don't, that's your choice. But I'd like to be clear about where things stand." Reese looked at her. He looked at Jake. Jake said nothing. He didn't need to. "All right," Reese said finally. The two words had weight to them, not graceful, not generous, but real. The weight of a man who has enough self-awareness to recognize when he's done. He put his hat to Catherine. He rode away. Hank let out a long breath from the barn door. Jake waited until the sound of hooves faded and then said, "That took guts." "No," Catherine said. "That was just the truth. The truth doesn't take guts. It takes clarity." She turned to look at him. "Thomas taught me that." "He taught you well," Jake said. "He did," she said simply and without grief. Just acknowledgement. Just love in its clearest form, which is the form that no longer needs to be sad. The weeks that followed moved with the speed of things going right, which is a different speed than things going wrong, less dramatic, more sustaining. Webb stayed through the first breeding arrangements and left with the handshake of a man who knows he'll be back. The first 3 breeding agreements were signed before November. Serious men with serious mares, 2 from Santa Fe and 1 from a ranch in Colorado, who'd heard about the certification through Webb's network and ridden 3 days to get there. The fees were what Webb had said they would be. More in one case. Hank sat with the numbers at the kitchen table one evening and did the arithmetic twice, and then said without looking up, "We're going to make December." "Yes," Catherine said. "With enough left over to start on the new barn." "I know." Hank looked up. "Catherine." Hank. "Well done," he said. Just that. From Hank it was everything. Jake and Tempest moved through those weeks together, in the rhythm they'd built the morning work that was never just work. The quiet hours that were doing something for both of them, that neither of them could have done alone. Jake had started working the foals from the other mares, and what he did with them bore the mark of everything his father had taught him: the patience, the honesty, the refusal to force what could be earned. Old Sam watched one afternoon and said, "You should be teaching this." "I am teaching it," Jake said, "just not in a classroom." Sam looked at the young horse responding to Jake's hands and said, "You know what I mean." Jake did. He thought about it later at the fence with Tempest, the way he thought about all the real things at the fence with the horse, with enough quiet to let the thought come to its own shape. He thought about what it meant to know something worth passing on. He thought about his father who had known something worth passing on and had also lost himself, and whether the two things were separable, and whether a man could carry the knowledge forward without the destruction. He thought he could. He thought he had evidence now. Marcus Ellery arrived in the 3rd week of November. He was 60, lean, with the formal bearing of a man who considered documentation a moral act rather than a bureaucratic one. And he spent 2 full days with Tempest observing, measuring, recording, with a thoroughness that made Webb's 40-minute assessment look like a first glance. On the second afternoon, he came to the house and sat at Catherine's table and opened his leather case and produced a document that was unlike any other document on the property, formal, registered, sealed, and placed it in front of her. "This is the full certification," he said. "Tempest registered as Sterling's Tempest descended from El Rey Oscuro. The lineage is confirmed beyond dispute." He paused. "Mrs. Sterling, you have one of the finest animals I have encountered in 30 years of this registry work. What Mr. Webb suspected, and what your ranch hand identified," he glanced at Jake, "was entirely correct." Jake said nothing. Catherine looked at the document. Then she opened the desk drawer. She took out Thomas's worn leather glove and held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it. Not performing grief, not saying goodbye, just acknowledging. just letting the moment be what it was, which was the completion of something Thomas had started when he'd walked toward a wild black horse and sat near him for 4 months and waited for the horse to decide. She put the glove on top of the certification document. Then she closed her hands around both of them. "Thank you," she said to Ellery, to Webb, who was sitting across the table, to Hank in the doorway, to old Sam, who'd come in from the barn for the occasion, to Billy, who was being very quiet, which was the sincerest form of respect he had. She looked at Jake last. Jake looked back at her. There was something in his eyes that was not there when he arrived. Not the absence of pain, because pain like his doesn't leave completely, but something present alongside it. Something that had grown up next to the loss, the way things grow in places that have been broken open, because broken open is also open. Because light gets in the same way everything else does. Because a man who has been empty long enough sometimes walks into a valley he didn't intend to visit and finds at a corral fence at sunrise exactly the thing he'd stopped believing he could find. In the weeks that followed, the valley talked. That was what valleys did and would always do. They talked about Sterling's Tempest, and the certification, and the breeding fees, and whether Catherine Sterling had known all along, or had gotten lucky. And the people who said lucky were not in the majority, because anyone who'd watched Catherine Sterling nail that notice back to the post every single time it was torn down, knew that luck had very little to do with what happened at that ranch. They talked about the cowboy, too. The quiet drifter from nowhere who'd stood at a fence for 3 days before going inside. Who'd turned down $50 in gold. Who'd identified a bloodline that changed everything. Who had stayed. Mabel Hutchins, to her credit, said in the general store one afternoon that she had misjudged the situation, which was the closest Mabel had ever come to an apology, and which the 9 people present received with appropriate solemnity. Pete Dawson came to the ranch for supper 3 weeks before Christmas and shook Jake's hand and said, "You did right by her." Jake said, "She did right by herself. I just showed up." Pete said, "That's enough. Sometimes that's everything." December's payment was made on time and in full. Cole signed the receipt with the expression of a man who is relieved in ways he won't articulate and who has learned something about the difference between a person who is vulnerable and a person who appears to be. The new barn went up in January. Jake built most of it himself with the hands working alongside him, and what he built was solid and well-proportioned and built to last the way things are built when the person building them intends to be there long enough to see it matter. On the last evening of January, with the barn complete and the breeding season approaching and the ranch in better order than it had been in 2 years, Catherine and Jake stood at the corral fence in the cold and watched Tempest in the last of the evening light. The horse was moving the way he moved when no one was asking anything of him, free and deliberate, and entirely himself, enormous and dark and alive, in a way that made you feel watching him. That aliveness was something you could learn from. Catherine said, "Thomas found him and waited for him." "Yes," Jake said. "You came and waited for him too," she said. "Yes," Jake said. "And he chose both of you," she said. Jake was quiet for a moment. "I think he chose this place," he said. "I think we're both what the place needed at different times." Catherine considered that. "What does it need now?" she said. Jake looked at her. She was looking at the horse, but the question was not about the horse. He took her hand. She held his. "What it has," he said quietly. "I think it needs exactly what it has." Tempest ran the length of the corral once fast and fully for no reason except that he wanted to, because that was who he was. Because a horse like that runs when he feels like running. And that feeling has nothing to do with anyone watching, and everything to do with the sheer animal fact of being alive and knowing it. He ran and came back to the center, and stood and looked at the fence with his head high and his sides moving. And the sight of him was what it had always been. Something that couldn't be owned, couldn't be broken, could only be met. Could only be understood. And the 2 people at that fence had learned that. The hard way, the slow way, the only way that makes it stick. The West had always sorted people that way, not by who was loudest or fastest or richest or most certain of themselves, By who was honest enough to wait? By who was brave enough to be still? By who understood that the wildest things are not the ones that need to be conquered. They are the ones worth learning to ride beside. And Jake Morrison, who had come from nowhere with nothing, who had turned his horse west on a Saturday evening, because something in him moved before his mind caught up, Jake Morrison had learned. He was home. That was the whole truth of it, and it was enough, and it would hold.